Hidden Lake on a summer evening. The late afternoon sun dyed the trees lining the lake a faded yellow, casting long shadows onto the still water. The man knew this scene like the back of his hand. He paddled his kayak out to the middle of the lake where he often fished. This rare piece was his reward after a long, tiring day. He had launched his kayak from his familiar spot, as always. There was always a large tree there to lean the boat against when he was done. More than an hour passed, and a few trout lay neatly in his cooler. Darkness began to creep in. The last rays of light were fading behind the canopy, and he prepared to head back. But then, a strange noise echoed from the edge of the lake, shattering the silence. He turned his head. A figure stood there, tilting a large container, pouring something into the lake. A dark liquid slowly spread, mixing with the clear water. Anger surged within the man. He was a nature lover, and this act felt like an insult. He couldn't stay silent. He shouted at the stranger who was polluting the environment. The person, startled, looked up, then hastily fled into the woods, the container still tilted, the liquid still pouring out. The man looked closer. The liquid looked like a dark red, but in the dim light, it was hard to be sure. A chilling sensation began to spread through his body. He decided to leave. Although he desperately wanted to report this to the authorities, a growing unease prevented him from lingering. He paddled the kayak back to his familiar spot, where he usually secured the boat. He took all his gear out of the kayak, preparing to pull it ashore. Just as he was covering the kayak with a tarp, a crack sounded nearby, like a foot stepping on a dry twig. He jumped and turned, about to ask, "Who's there?" but stopped himself. He hastily finished covering the kayak, not even bothering to lean it against the tree as usual, instead leaving it flat on the ground. He quickly gathered his gear and cooler, hurrying out of the woods towards the path leading home. The short walk suddenly felt immensely long. He kept looking back, feeling like someone was watching him. Reaching home, he quickly threw his gear into the shed, then rushed inside, slamming the door shut. He'd never locked his door so fast. After cleaning the trout he'd caught, he put them in the fridge, planning to cook them tomorrow. Tonight, he just reheated some leftovers. Just as he put the food in the microwave, there was a knock at the door. The fear and anxiety he'd felt on the way home surged back. His suspicion of being followed had become reality. Who would be knocking on his door at this hour? The lights were on. His car was in the driveway. It was obvious someone was home. But he had drawn the curtains tightly, so no one could see inside. The knocking came again. The microwave beeped, signaling it was done. The person outside surely heard it. Then, the knocking sounded again, this time on the window. A man's voice called out, "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier. I just want to explain." There was no way he was opening the door for this person. His instinct screamed that this was dangerous. He had followed him home. He kept knocking on a window and calling out. Finally, the man decided to respond. He shouted loudly, "Go away, or I'm calling the police." He planned to call anyway, but it was a warning. The man outside replied calmly, "Sir, if you could just open the door, I can explain everything." He repeated his threat. There was no further response. He hurried to close and lock all the windows and turn on the air conditioning. Then, he called the emergency police number, reporting both the dumping incident at the lake and the man showing up at his house. He also filed an online report with the Environmental Protection Agency. Making these reports made him feel a little safer going to bed. But luckily, he was a light sleeper. Around 2 a.m., he heard a loud noise downstairs. He shot up in bed and grabbed his Glock from the closet. He heard footsteps stealthily ascending the creaking wooden stairs. He gripped the gun tightly, positioned himself behind his bedroom door, aiming the gun towards the opening. The footsteps grew closer. His room was the closest to the stairs, so naturally, It was the first one the intruder would check. And sure enough, he heard the doorknob slowly turn, and the door creaked open. He could only make out the intruder's silhouette in the darkness. He switched on the bedside lamp so the intruder could see his gun. He yelled, "Get down!" The intruder raised his hands, seemingly gesturing for him to calm down. He was holding a small knife. The man told him to drop the knife, but the intruder calmly said, "I'm leaving," then turned and fled downstairs. The man yelled for him to stop, but the intruder was clearly betting he was too scared to pull the trigger. He heard the intruder leave through the front door. He rushed downstairs, bolted the door shut again, and called 911. The living room window was shattered, glass sprayed across the floor. He didn't take his eyes off the broken window until the police arrived. He had to explain that he'd reported the incident earlier, afraid that if he waited until morning, the container would disappear in the dark. He went back with 2 officers to the spot where he'd seen the man dumping the substance. But after a 20-minute search, the container was gone. The man had surely left no trace. He gave the police the most detailed description he could of the man. He was a short, white man with a beard, balding hair, glasses, wearing a black flannel shirt and black pants. After the police left, he stayed in the living room all night, his gun beside him, watching TV. There was no way he could sleep with a broken window and a madman potentially lurking outside. When dawn broke, his brother came over to help fix the window. His brother, Dale, stayed with him for a few nights until things calmed down. His wild theory was that the container held human remains, possibly dissolved in some kind of acid. Otherwise, why would the man follow him home and then break in? Presumably to kill him. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. He knew that if he had opened the door for that man, something terrible might have happened to him.
This fishing trip was unlike any others I had ever been on. My friends and I had been planning this for months, heading to a remote lake deep in the forest, far away from any towns or populated areas. It was a place we'd only heard about from longtime anglers, people who seemed to know the secret spots that only a few knew of. This lake was not only famous for its tranquility, but also for the large fish that could be found there, especially the big black bass. We set out early in the morning, the small boat cutting through the mist that still lingered over the lake. The air was crisp, and the silence was almost eerie. As the sun slowly rose, the whole scene felt magical. My friends and I chatted happily, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was just a sense of unease that lingered in the air. By mid-morning, we decided to move to a smaller cove that we thought would be great for fishing. As the day went on, we started catching fish, large ones that made us cheer and laugh. Everything was going smoothly, but as the day turned to dusk, things started to feel off. A thick fog began rolling in over the lake, surrounding us completely. It grew denser by the minute, and soon, we couldn't even see the other side of the lake. I looked at my friend Mark, who seemed just as uneasy as I felt. "I've never seen fog like this," he said, his voice tense. By now, it was getting harder to see, and we realized we couldn't make our way back to shore. The fog seemed to trap us in place, and the boat was eerily still. We began to talk less and less, each of us feeling a growing sense of dread. Then, Mark was the first to hear something. He stopped, motioning for us to be quiet. "Do you hear that?" he whispered urgently. We listened, but at first there was nothing. Then, faintly, we heard it, a sound coming from the shore. It was hard to make out, but it was a voice, a human voice calling from the distance. At first, we thought it might just be someone lost, or perhaps another fisherman. But when we looked closer, we saw figures moving through the fog on the shore. 3 people, walking slowly, almost deliberately. They weren't making any noise, and their movement was unnatural. It sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know who these people were, but something told me they weren't friendly. We all fell silent, watching them approach without making a sound. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, and my mind raced with questions. Why were they out here, and why were they so quiet? The figures got closer, and I realized they were wearing strange, tattered clothing. It wasn't like the usual gear you'd expect from a fisherman or a hiker. They moved in perfect synchrony, with no words exchanged between them. The whole thing felt wrong. As the fog thickened, I could barely make out their faces, but what I did see sent a shiver down my spine. There was something unsettling about the way they looked at us, as if they were studying us, waiting for the right moment to approach. Then, without warning, we heard the sound of something heavy being dragged through the woods behind us. We all turned around, and there they were, more of them, at least 10, stepping out of the mist, dressed in what looked like tribal attire, their faces obscured by shadows. They held long wooden staffs, and their eyes were cold and emotionless. I didn't wait another second. I immediately grabbed the oars and started paddling frantically toward the shore. My friends followed suit, and we didn't stop to look back. The figures didn't chase us, but they didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to make us panic. As we reached the shore, we jumped out of the boat, pulling it in as quickly as we could. But the strange group of people was still watching us from the mist. They didn't move closer, but they didn't leave either. They just stood there, silent, as we scrambled to get to safety. We didn't take any chances. We left everything behind, grabbing only the essentials before heading back to the car. I could feel their eyes on us the entire time. When we reached the car, I looked back one last time, and there they were, standing at the edge of the woods, just watching us, as if they were waiting for us to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, even as we drove off. We called the police, but when they arrived, the figures were gone. There were no traces, no signs of what we had seen. They searched the area, but it was as if those people had never been there. We never went back to that lake again, but I still wonder, who were they, and why did they choose that day to show themselves?